everybody, welcome back to the Genesis Part 2 Bible Study. We are on week 5 today, covering Genesis 34 through 36, and we have the awesome pleasure of having one of our teachers, Angela, with us tonight.
Hey everybody, glad to be here. I'm excited.
I'm so excited to have you. If you guys were with us for part 1, Angela crushed one of our teaching segments. So I've just been waiting and chomping at the bit to get her back on here so we can talk some more Genesis.
Thank you. That's so kind. I always get the genealogy, so I'm back for more.
Hey, you killed them. Honestly, I have never had more fun reading genealogies than when we did that section. So,
thanks.
And as always, we're joined by our awesome Zoom crew today. Hey, Chloe, Jordan, DJ, Lacey, Trisha, and Noah coming to say some awesome wisdom as we approach this text. Yeah. So let's see. Last week, we talked about a lot of things. It was a big week. Jacob left Laban. He had an encounter with this divine man, wrestled with, some people say God, some people say something else, this thing that we don't know. And then he had this reconciliation moment with Esau. So we see all of these awesome things happening that kind of set the scene for today's reading. So where do we go from here? What do we need to know?
All is well, right? He's made up with Esau. He's faced the music, so to speak. But we're also wrapping up the Jacob narratives tonight. So I think in order to wrap it up well, let's go back to where it started a little bit. If we go back to chapter 28, remember Jacob has this dream and God tells him, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. He reaffirms the covenant promises. He says, very clear statement, behold, I will be with you and will keep you wherever you go and will return you to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And he wakes up and he says, surely the Lord is in this place. And he makes a vow and he says, if God will be with me, if he will keep me in this way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. So Jacob's young in his faith. He says, I'm going to wait and see. You do this and then you'll be my God. And God's been faithful. Yeah. So where Stephen took us last week back to Shechem, you're going to find that they get to Shechem, the land of Canaan. If we just look at the end of those last 2 verses in chapter 33, it says, and from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. So we see that God continues to fulfill his promise to Jacob. Yeah. And in chapter 31, God says, go back to Bethel. But is he back in Bethel? He's not quite there, is it? He buys a piece of land, so we know he's settling peaceably among the people. But keep in mind, he's only about a day's journey from Bethel.
So do you think
he's
this
not
was
even that far?
Like an intentional thing? Do you think he knew that he wasn't?
I do. We see a delayed obedience. I feel like God's instruction was pretty clear, and specifically showing us that he bought some land with this foreign group of people. He's settling down and he's getting comfortable. Gotcha. But I think we do see a delayed obedience. Now, as we get into chapter 34, we're going to walk through a tragic and complicated event in Jacob's family. We witness a brutal crime against Dinah. Something you may have noticed when you studied this chapter is that Dinah is silent throughout. We don't hear about her affliction. We don't hear about her pain. She isn't even a part of the resolution in it all. Yeah. She has no voice, and we're kind of left to wonder, what does that mean? But who else doesn't have a voice in this? Who else is silent in this? God. We don't hear from God at all in this event. Yeah. Does that mean his voice doesn't matter? Does that mean his sovereign will won't come to pass? Does that mean his promise is null and void? So when we see silence in the Bible, this is what I feel. I want to go in and I want to fill in the blanks. I want to fill in the blanks of here's what should have been said. Here's how this person was really feeling. This is what really he should have done in that moment. But I think when God is silent, there's one thing that we can be sure of, and we can be sure of just trusting in his presence. And to me, that kind of makes sense in light of what Jacob is learning about God. We've been asking this question throughout the study, who is this God and why can we trust him? And I think we're going to come to find out why as we keep going. So this chapter really establishes the storyline that's coming up. Something happens to Jacob and his family on the way back to Bethel. Something causes him to get moving again. But let's read together. We're just going to look at the first 4 verses of chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." So here we have this brutal crime against Dinah. It's the main conflict we're going to see in this affliction against Jacob's family.
Yeah.
You may say, Jacob's family? Well, an attack on Dinah is an attack on the family. I don't know if that's ever happened in your family where somebody's hurt and it's like, oh, you hurt them, you've hurt me too.
It's this it's this familial unity. Almost.
Oh, yeah. The whole family is going to be involved in what happened. And so just right from the beginning, we see, wait a second, this perpetrator, Shechem, we know that name. Right? This is the very people group who he bought land from. And I think that's why we see that here, that we were living peaceably among them together, and now something bad has happened.
Broken.
But let's talk about Dinah. Let's just stop and establish a few things. She's the daughter of Leah, the less favored wife. This may mean that she herself was less favored. She is believed to be between 13 and 15 years old. And by this time, they had likely lived in the land for 7 or 8 years. So they've been there for a bit. Her name means judgment, vindication, or God will judge. Now, she's young. She's unmarried. She's a virgin. She's out socializing with the women of a pagan land, unsupervised. So immediately we can make a couple of observations about her, but I'm curious what you guys are seeing so far. What observations are you already making about this situation? What are a couple things that stick out to you about Dinah specifically?
It reminded me a little bit about some of the behavior we saw with Rachel and Leah, like going out particularly. I don't know. That kind of struck me, like that idea of coming to like where the social things were happening.
Yeah. Anybody else have any observations you want to share? What are you thinking about Dinah at this point? Or maybe what questions are you asking?
I think for me, it's always, I don't know if, I mean, this is not correct, but it's really easy to view scripture or like the Bible as this positive story.
Yeah.
Or this, or sometimes even, unfortunately, this like these stories that only just have a purpose and not necessarily these events that have happened.
Yeah.
And I think moments like these really draw me back into kind of the reality of it. And they say like, and they remind me, everything's always not always like sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes there's reality in this that, like kind of like you said, our God is not present in the action, but He's there
His presence,
with those people. And I know that's both encouraging and also, I don't know, it makes me want to read it more, I guess. Because
I know what you mean.
It's not these aren't just fables from far off.
Right. This is someone's real life. And Dinah here, we see her being unsupervised. So what does that make you think? It's like, well, has her father not protected her? Because I mean, that's unusual. That's unusual for a young girl to be out socializing in a foreign culture.
Yeah. Because this wouldn't just be like she went to the other house in the neighborhood, right? This would be...
No, they live a little bit out in the country, and that's her really making a trek into the city to kind of see what the city was all about.
But she should have had a patriarch with her, like a brother.
You might think that. We also see just a lack of wisdom when we think about sexual violence against women was common in pagan societies, especially for a woman unsupervised. And sexually immoral behavior was woven into the fabric of some of these societies, even in their religious systems. Think back to Abram and Sarai when they go to Egypt. Right. Also, when they go to Gerar, think of Sodom. So it wasn't unusual for a woman to experience that. So it does seem like, wow, we see a real lack of wisdom. Who was looking out for her? Something's missing, right?
Yeah, I hadn't even made that connection with all the times Abraham feared for Sarah's life.
Yeah.
Like that was...
Yeah, so all that's kind of sticking out like, that's unusual. But let's talk about Shechem. What do we know about him in these first 4 verses? He's a prince. He's the son of Hamor, the Hivite. He's the chieftain in that area. So that alone tells us he is in a position of power. And as opposed to Dinah, later on in the chapter, we're going to learn he is the most favored in his house That's an interesting statement. Heck, the whole city is named after him, and his name means personal interest. Interesting. We see a chain of uninterrupted verbs. He saw her. He took her. He lay with her. He humiliated her. The NASB would have lay her by force. So we're going to take just a quick look at those. He saw her and took her. Now we see this in Genesis 3:6 when Eve, she saw the fruit, she took it. We see this also in chapter 6 when the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them. Very interesting to me that both of those moments of seeing and taking were followed by a judgment of some kind. So we'll just kind of keep that there. We'll just hold that little idea there. But he lay her and he humiliated her. Lay her could mean consensual, but the way the Hebrew verb is used in this instance implies a negative, like incest or adultery, something irregular, something outside the divine boundaries that God has set forth for us. Humiliated, it's the same Hebrew verb used in the rape of Tamar. 2 Samuel 13, King David's son Amnon rapes Tamar, and she says, "No, do not force me." So same verb there, to afflict or to humble, to shame or to distress someone. It implies some sort of an abuse that's happening to this person. Another instance where you may see that word, how the Egyptians afflicted the Hebrew people. They were in bondage, sort of holding them against, making them do what they did not want to do. Also the Philistines, you guys know the story of Samson. Yeah. They wanted to afflict and humble him. They wanted to bind him against his will, afflict him. So we see this evolution of an abuse of power. It's a violent taking, and then the pain and humiliation that's just heaped on Dinah in the process. Shechem seems to be in love with her. He speaks tenderly to her. That might mean that he was trying to console her in her distress. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was received. So he's trying to move her heart in a certain way, and he tells his father, "Get me this girl." But is this love? You know, how is Shechem's love showing himself so far, showing itself to her? What does his love mean for her? Does anyone have any feedback on that? I'm curious what you guys are seeing. What does his love, how is it presenting itself?
He's very selfish and self-centered. It's, I can't see how maybe he doesn't know how to love or.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. He's living up to his name, personal interest. It was about giving him what he wants. The other side of that is what his love has cost her, because his love has cost her everything. Losing her virginity equaled stealing her future. At that time in ancient Near Eastern culture, for a woman, her virginity was her ticket to marriage, to kids, to reputation in the land, to economic support. So because without a husband, you don't have a way to support yourself. She was totally vulnerable. But here's the thing, sexual assault now deemed her no longer marriageable. So his love cost her her future. Imagine something stolen from you in that sense.
And comparing that with what we've talked about in the previous weeks, this hesed, this steadfast faithfulness of God, and like how that love versus this love. I mean, we really get to see the ways of Yahweh versus the ways of man.
Oh, absolutely. And we see his love is soulish. It's physical. It's lust. It's giving me what I want. I mean, he just flat demands from his dad, go get me this woman. Now, in Mosaic law, we'll see an application to social justice in this very kind of situation. So I want to read a couple of these things to you just to help us understand what's happening. But in Exodus 22, verse 16 and 17, it says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. Crazy. Keep going. Deuteronomy 22. Verses 28 and 29, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all of his days. So social justice for a woman who's been taken in this way, her future stolen, was to say that he had to marry her and take care of her. So if we think back to Amnon and Tamar again in 2 Samuel 13, after he does this thing to her, he hates her. He doesn't even want to look at her anymore, and he wants her to leave. But she says, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." So this proposal of marriage in the natural, it may have been the best way forward for all involved. And that's tough for us with our Western view of things to consider. It's tough.
I know it's really easy to look at this and be like, man, how antiquated of an idea. Oh man, they just didn't get it. But I think like in that context, this was radical social justice.
Oh,
like no other cultures did that.
Yeah,
This Hebraic rule was like
absolutely.
And I think it can be easy to look back and say, man, look at what God said to do. That's just crazy. But I think that's really encouraging that, man, God in this moment was miles ahead.
Right. There was something cultural that we had to consider about where they were at in this time. So I think that just has to be something we have to sort of remove and think what was normal for this culture at that time. When we think about Jacob, he now hears about it, right? If we're moving on to verse 5, he heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with the livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came, and Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak to him. And the sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant. They were very angry because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing must not be done. So we see this word defiled for the first time. We're going to continue to see it further. But Jacob held his peace. Man, I really struggled with this just as a parent. Part of me didn't want to say, oh, he was passive. He was wrong. But he is. He is being passive. Did he simply not care about his daughter? Another consideration, was his back against the wall? I mean, if you're a foreigner living among a foreign people, your welfare is really dependent upon the whim of the king. Or else you better have a bunch of allies beside you. So did he hold his peace because he's grown a little bit in wisdom and he's waiting for the sons to come back? I think we'll find as we continue to walk it out, though, that there is a sense of spiritual passivity and also a little bit of passivity in his parenting. And man, I didn't want to say that about him. I really tried. One thing to consider also at this point is, we'll find out later in the story, but Dinah is at Shechem's house right now while they're trying to come and begin this marriage proposal. So there's a lot at stake. Jacob does have a responsibility to lead his family. His response does seem passive. He has already been seen to compromise in his delayed obedience, not going all the way back to Bethel. He has comfortably settled among this foreign land. Dinah was unchaperoned. He seems a little bit to be checked out. And there was a passage from Genesis 18 that I wanted to share with you guys that I thought was really beautiful for this moment specifically. When the Lord is talking about Abraham, he says, in 18 verse 19, he says, "For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." So we see this call to lead your family, to lead your household, but also to do righteousness and justice. And that's going to be a theme throughout this chapter. So what about the brothers, Simeon and Levi? If you look at their birth order, you've got Reuben, you've got Simeon, you've got Levi, and then you have Judah. That's the first four. And we know that birth order matters. Genealogy, it's your favorite. I know it matters. So as we're following along the storyline for Simeon and Levi, this is their full-blood sister. They feel an obligation to protect her, to protect her honor. Could it be because their father didn't show enough regard for her? Maybe, no doubt, in some ways, their reputation was on the line. So they heard what happened. They're outraged. They're shocked. They're furious at what's happened. They're grieved. They call what's happened an outrageous thing. Here are a couple examples in the Bible of what is considered outrageous. I think sometimes words are common, like, that's amazing, and everything's amazing.
Yeah.
But in the Bible, outrageous, if you think about a woman who gets married and she has lied about her virginity, it's considered a covenant violation and punishable by death. That's an outrageous thing to do to someone. Think of Achan, who stole things from God when they were conquering Jericho. They're stealing from God. That was an outrageous thing to do, punishable by death. Same thing with King David's son Amnon, who rapes his sister. Outrageous thing to do. And another one, Jeremiah, he calls out the prophets. The prophets that are supposed to be speaking for God are lying and also committing adultery. That was an outrageous thing to do, to say you were speaking for God and to be lying. Yeah. So this isn't the first outrageous thing in the Bible. We have several instances, but we serve an amazing God who works even through outrageous sin. I know.
I'm thankful for that.
I know. It's tough. It's tough. So they set out and they begin their negotiations. Yeah. And Hamor, his father goes and he's like, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. The soul, there we go. There's that soulish, physical, low-level sort of love. And he's like, please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall come and dwell with us. The land will be open to you. Dwell and trade in it. Get property in it. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and a gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife. So we see this offer. The beginning of negotiations are happening. They seem to genuinely want to make it right. Right? By all accounts, they are genuine. I want to do what's right. But their motivation isn't about justice, and it's not about righteousness. There's no acknowledgement of what happened. There's no apology. They don't even bring it up. That's not even said. So they continue to sort of pursue what they want in it.
That personal interest.
Oh, it shines all throughout this thing. But interesting, I didn't catch this the first time I read it, but verse 8, when it says Shechem longs for your daughter, that your in verse 8 is plural in Hebrew. It's very interesting. And then we see, give us your daughters in verse 9. So this is telling us that the offer is bigger than a marriage proposal to Dinah. There's something bigger happening here. Yeah. And it turns into this pitch for economic prosperity and the joining of these two people groups. We're going to keep going because that's going to keep getting bigger for us as we get a view of what's happening. The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully because he had defiled their sister Dinah. There we see that word again, defiled. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace. Again, not only defiled, but disgraced, a theme running through, and it sort of intensifies the weight of what Shechem has done. We can see why they're outraged. And they say, only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are by every male among you being circumcised. And then we will give our daughters to you. We will take your daughters to ourselves. We'll dwell with you. We will be one people. That sounds familiar. And they say, basically, you don't do this, we're going to take our daughter and we'll be out of here. So the offer to Jacob's family is to become one people. Plural. When was the last time we saw this type of proposal of humanity pulling together to be one people? Is this familiar to any
Babel.
of you? Yeah, Babel. We see the same thing. And what was Babel? It was this reversal of God's purposes, a reversal of God's purposes for his people. But so what's at stake? I mean, really, what's at stake here, right? They're trying to make this right in the natural. This looks like it might be a good thing. What would you say is at stake here if they decide to go for it? I mean, Jacob's being pretty passive. He and Hamor may come together and just be like, yeah, we can figure this out together. But what's at stake? Love to hear from you guys on that.
The blessing that Jacob received is on the line here because like he's now at a place where he just received it and I feel like is now like accepted responsibility. Like this is on my shoulders to take this and go. And I think that might be why he's passive, because he's got such a big decision on his hand. He wants to be like super careful of like what's the next steps he takes. But yeah, that's on the line.
That's good. There is a lot on the line.
Do you think he understands God's faithfulness in this moment, or understands like the blessing in this moment?
I think he understands that God is good and has been with him, but I think that he has also let fear be his guide. And if you can imagine, if you're going to say no to this, we talked about this earlier, you better have a whole group of allies coming to your rescue. And now Esau's already went one direction, Jacob went a different direction. So he seems, and you find that later in the narrative, being very concerned about the people. So this is jeopardizing the covenant promise. God ain't going to let that happen. Abraham's family losing their distinctiveness, intermarriage with a pagan people. So Jacob's, the sons, they start plotting immediately. They're deceitful, and we see that up front. They're a chip off the old block, as they say. Yeah. But what's their motivation? Is it protecting the covenant family line? Is it zeal for God's name and reputation among the nations? No, they were set on revenge in their anger. They wanted to defend their sister's honor. And what was purposed to be a sign of unity of the covenant people with God has now been used to perpetrate a murder. The purpose of the sign itself, now a reversal of God's intention. These weren't people that were joining the family of God. This was Jacob's family joining with them.
That's good.
Walter Brueggemann writes, the most precious symbol of faith now has become a tool of inhumanity. It's pretty shocking to us, but again, we see those reversals. Do they just not understand? Do they not care? But they accept the agreement. They're quick to accept it, right? Verse 18, the words pleased Hamor and his son, the young men, they did not delay, and they immediately go out to try to convince all the men in their city. So it's not a kingdom, he's a chieftain. So they have power, but he still has to get the people sort of on his side and going with him. And you can see, how does he entice them? He says, only on this condition we'll do this, but their daughters are going to be our wives, and our daughters will be their wives. Will not their livestock, their property, all their beasts be ours? So that same thing, they're not looking to join with Jacob's family. They're wanting Jacob's family to come and join and be one people with them. So
it almost sounds a little deceitful too. He says, will not their livestock, property, and beasts be ours? Only let them agree with us, and then they will dwell with us. Almost like, hey, if we get them this time, then we can take it all.
So you can see even their own deceit as they try to persuade the people, relying on promises, prosperity, and wealth, and we're going to become one people with them. Their things are going to be ours. They're all for this outward sign, the outward sign of circumcision, but they had zero conversion in their hearts. For them, acceptance of this religious ritual was for the purpose of economic gain. That was it. There wasn't a change of heart that happened here. And so on the third day, they're very sore. The two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, they took their swords and they came against the city and killed all the males. They killed Hamor, his son Shechem, with a sword. They took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled. There's that word again, defiled, that theme. And now who's doing the taking? They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones, their wives, all that was in the houses they took. So they proceed to slaughter the men. They kill the chieftain, the prince. They plunder the city. They do the taking. But remember when we talked earlier about how Shechem saw and took, similar to Eve, and we saw the sons of God taking the daughters of men, and both were followed by a judgment. Do we see a judgment here? Is this God's judgment or man's judgment? What I kind of wrestled with that for a while, because It's tough. This is a very tough issue. Any of you have feedback? Any of the Zoom fam have feedback on like what you were wrestling with that?
I didn't necessarily wrestle with it. To me, it was more like it took matters into their own hands, kind of like they've always done.
Yes. Well, way to just nail it right away. You didn't even make that difficult.
We got a pretty slick crew.
I mean, that's essentially what we see throughout their narratives already, is how they continue to make things happen for themselves. John Sailhammer writes this: Jacob and his family have continuously been characterized as those who attempted to carry out God's intentions by means of their own plans and schemes. On the surface, their plans worked reasonably well. Though they always involved cunning and deceit to succeed, the writer does not wish to suggest that such plans represented God's own plans, but on the contrary, Jacob's plans and those of his family are always depicted as plans of those who are far ahead of God and his plan. So the ultimate purpose here shows that nothing will get in the way of God's plan and purposes and the eventual success. He works through good and he works through evil, through human failure, through sin. He has promised himself to his people, and that should give us all great hope. I mean, if God can only work through good, we have a lot of problem here.
Yeah.
Being stuck on earth where there's a lot of sin.
Yeah.
So nothing is going to get in the way of his purposes. But this narrative gives us the backstory also to why Simeon and Levi are passed over for the inheritance, which we read about in Genesis 49. I thought it might give us a little bit of an extra sort of picture. Genesis 49, 5 and 7, Jacob is on his deathbed. Here's what he says about them. Simeon and Levi are brothers. So essentially they're two of a kind. Weapons of violence are their swords, basically meaning their cutting became a weapon of violence. That cutting of the circumcision, but also with the swords, they represented anarchy and not justice. Let my soul not come into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. The name Levi means joined. So that's interesting. He's doing a little play there that I don't want to be joined with them, that they joined in an unholy union together. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. They were ruthless. They were excessive in what they did. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob, and I will scatter them in Israel. So they lose their territory. Jacob disassociates himself from them for their disregard for human values. That's not going to be the way we want to represent God to the nations.
Right.
It doesn't take away from the fact that what happened to Dinah was wrong and inhumane. So the last couple of verses, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land. My numbers are few. They gather against me and attack me. Will be destroyed, me and my household. And they say, but should he treat our sister like a prostitute? So Jacob has a response now, doesn't he? He has an overwhelming response. He sharply rebukes their actions. He's not so silent now. He's worried. He's worried about himself. He's worried about his family. How am I going to defend them? How am I going to protect them?
Yeah. I mean, even there, he kind of disassociates them by his language.
Oh, absolutely.
Both I and my household instead of both I and our household, you know?
That's very true. His sons have acted in violent anarchy. They've shown a lack of justice and righteousness to the nations. The Bible describes making a false god as idolatry, but to pretend to be God is injustice. And that's exactly where we've landed in this story. But it ends with a question, which I thought was interesting. Should he treat our sister like a prostitute? There's only 2 instances in the Old Testament where a scene concludes with a question in that way. I just thought it was interesting. The other instance is the book of Jonah. There, the text centers around God's right to destroy this people or to deliver them. And remember Jonah, he runs, belly of a whale. You guys know that song. And the question is, we're left to conclude that it is God who decides. And I thought it was interesting because I saw a similar theme here of who's going to decide what's right and wrong. But also this question sort of reinforces, where Simeon and Levi, where their motivations were. the bigger theme here, I would say, is who is treating who like a prostitute. I mean, if you really just scoot way back, let's try to get a big view of what's happening in this chapter. They prostituted the covenant sign for murderous revenge. Have they themselves been enjoying the benefits of God without the heart commitment? God's after their loyalty as a nation. Remember who our audience is. You're getting ready to set out and you're going to be my witness to these people. God has a distinct role for them among the nations. You have zeal for your name, but what about my name? Their motivations weren't in line with God's purposes. And also we see God's faithfulness despite his people's failures. Man, that's good news to me. Yeah. Psalm 89:14, I thought this was beautiful. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. That is who this God is. This is why we can trust him.
Wow.
So, yeah, a lot to take in with that chapter. But when you start to scoot back and see something bigger, what Dinah represents is the nation of Israel. You start to see how they're going to be and live among these people. And I think we're going to see some answers to that in chapter 35 that will let us keep digging around in that theme a little bit more.
Wow. Was such a hard story. I read that, I got done, and I was like, man, I have no idea. Where do we go in here? What's the redeeming? And
trust me, I felt the same way.
Well, for me, that the imagery of, who prostituted what, that's super helpful for me. Just understanding like these people who are making this claim are also ones who are doing this with Yahweh.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And we know Jacob's faith was young, but he's been progressing. He's been moving forward. And we're going to talk about that in the coming chapter. But as we move into the next couple of chapters, 35 and 36, we're going to just see a rapid fire of events as we begin to close out the Jacob narratives. Gotcha. Chapter 35, we're going to see a little bit about purification. So here we've gone from this chapter 34, all about defilement, disgrace, and now we're moving into purification. God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, change your garments, then let us arise and go up to Bethel so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. And so they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. Purification. Jacob, in a sense, I almost feel like he's reclaiming his spiritual leadership. We've seen some passive parenting. We've seen some interesting sort of dysfunction in the family. And in this sense, he's going, hold up. It's time, you guys. He's in great distress.
Yeah.
How is he going to take his next steps where he's at? And he starts to lead. Passive no more.
The foreign gods part really got me because we see last week where his wife had foreign gods.
Yeah. Rachel's going to have to put away her foreign gods.
And he hadn't taken that spiritual leadership role there yet.
No. And if you ever study the Old Testament and you look at the period of the kings, you'll see over and over again that as the king went, so went the people. If the king was following God and honoring God, the people were doing well and following God. And so I felt like that was a really good picture. As the leader goes, so goes the people. Yeah. So we see him doing something different. They are going to have to put away all that they maybe had plundered from that city after the massacre. They've probably acquired a lot of things in the 7 to 8 years that they've lived there. Also changing their clothes, symbolizing this sort of spiritual renewal that happens. But it's interesting. Now Jacob declares who this God is and why we can trust him. The God who answers him in his distress and has been with him wherever he goes. Something has changed. Maybe it's deeper. I don't know if you've probably experienced this in your spiritual journey, but there was a time when I knew God, and I know him. And then there's a time that I know God. And often it's going through a hard time. It's going through a distressing period in your life, and something changes. So it just makes me see that progression of faith that's happened for him. We've seen that play out in his narratives. What do you see in his progression of faith? Is there anything that kind of stuck out to you with that for our Zoom fam?
I think for his progression, we've kind of seen in Genesis so far that God has been renaming people, and he is about to rename Jacob as well. But I think of all the people that have been renamed, Jacob, he's done a lot more things wrong than other people. And this turning point of he's now gone from saying, if God is with me, to God is with me. And that's big verbiage change for him. But I think this is now also him. He's not going to be living by his past. He's going to be living by his future. And God is renaming him and claiming that over his life.
Come on.
Yes, I love that. Before God says, this is who I am, then he says he is the God of my fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and now he is his God, the God who hears me. And it became very personal. That's kind of what I was feeling when I got to this chapter, because I was like, what's the point of 34 in the middle of these? Right? He makes up with Esau. He's going back, and we see there's something different that's happening in his heart that's going to change the course of the direction that he's going. It's now time to go and journey and build the altar. Verse 5, let's keep reading. As they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Here, God's still protecting them. And there he goes to build an altar. They make this journey to build the altar. God protects them. But, this is the first time a patriarch is actually instructed to build an altar. Just thought that was interesting. We've seen this happen, but this is the first time they're told to build an altar. We might compare this command with God instructing Abraham to offer a burnt offering. Now, this test appears to be really easy in comparison, right? Like, he's not being asked to offer his son, but you need to remember that their reputation among the nations is not good. He fears traveling, and he's now going to have to travel and go and build this altar. So in a way, it's kind of like him demonstrating his faithfulness and passing his own test.
It's a lot like saying Jacob was here,
Yeah.
So if they're looking for him to get revenge, they found it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. He passes the test. He goes to do the thing. And I want you to remember our author and our audience right now, who's writing. The Israelites have to find a way to stay in the land with the Canaanites, but also not kill the Canaanites. We have to live in the land. This is our promised land, but I have to be able to do this in a way where I'm not going to kill them. But how do you do this and stay faithful? What are the options here? Do you either accommodate the culture around you, or you're going to destroy the culture around you? And we come to see Israel engage in these sort of practices that demonstrate faithfulness and preserving their distinctiveness as a people of God through their own sexual purity, through rite of circumcision, by renouncing idolatry. And in Deuteronomy, Moses is sharing some final words of wisdom and teaching. Gotta love this guy. Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 and 8, and he kind of speaks to this. He says, "See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this is a great nation. This great nation is wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I've set before you today?" So they're both separating themselves from the surrounding nations, but they're also being a witness to them. And so you kind of see that with this, building of an altar, these sort of rites of purification, and the way that they begin to live is going to help them live among the nations and be a witness.
That's really good. That's really good.
They have to know their role before they go in and possess the land, because this isn't going to be the first time they come against difficulty. Moving on, we see Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, died. This is a little bit random to me. You normally don't see a woman listed among the deaths. And not only that, Deborah traveled with Rebecca. So to me, this feels like sort of shedding off the old. The end of an era is happening. And we keep going. God appeared to Jacob again. He blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel should be your name." Exactly what Lacey was alluding to the second time he called his name Israel. God said to him, "I am the God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac will be yours." And he goes on, he's basically summing up and just with even stronger language, reconfirming the promises to him. Much has taken place since God first appeared to him in a dream. Right? There's been marriages, birth of children, family strife, celebrations, tragedies, new sins forgiven. And you can sense that what's taking place here is deeper and it's richer in Jacob's heart. The promise is fertility and nationhood and kingship and territory. A nation is kind of coming into being here. And again, we see the same thing with Abraham's journey to make this burnt offering. There, God also reconfirmed the promises to him. So this is a significant sort of turning point in the Jacob narratives.
Yeah, it's hopeful. It's almost way back in Genesis 12, that initial call of, this is what I have for you. Dream with me. Know that this is your place. Know that I have called you to this. Yeah,
that's so good. And to see that it's coming to pass and he's getting it, because we've seen the hardship of Jacob, we've seen the difficulty he's dealt with, but we see some more quick transitions that are happening in the storyline. They journey from Bethel. Rachel went into labor, right? She's going to have the last of their children. Now that we have Benjamin, it sort of completes the family of Jacob. Now she names him Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow, but it has a double meaning, son of my sorrow or vigor. So in some sense, sorrow because she's dying, vigor because she's had a son. This is good. Typically the mother had the naming rights, but Jacob displays this sort of renewed leadership. Rachel's gone. He renames the child Benjamin, also with a double meaning, son of my right hand or of my old age. And then more dysfunction. Man, I thought we were past the family dysfunction, but verse 21, we see as they journeyed on, while Israel lived in the land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now, Reuben's act here is incest, and Reuben is Leah's firstborn son, and Bilhah was Rachel's maidservant, whom she had given to Jacob to bear her children. To her was born Dan and Naphtali. So remember, we talked about outrageous acts in the Bible. They continue to happen. But what do you think Reuben's motivation is here? Why would he go and do this right now at this time? Maybe it's not completely chronological, but we know Rachel is gone. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? On like what Reuben's motivation would have been to do this? Is this lust? Is this something else? What do you think, Zoom family?
Is it potentially him trying to like grasp at some position of like authority or leadership?
Yes, that's so good.
It's kind of reminiscent of like when Absalom was in like rebellion against his father David, and he did like the same thing with David's concubines.
Thank you for teaching my message, Jordan. Thank you. Are you still keeping points for everyone?
Yeah. How much do you want to give them?
Who's the leader?
So right now, DJ and Noah are both tied with 10,000. So
okay, I would like to give him 10,100.
Okay, we can do that. I will add that to the docket.
That's true. So some would say that he wanted to ensure that Leah didn't take the position of the primary wife, now that Rachel was gone, or he wanted Leah to take that position. Some would say that Rachel's gone, I'm going to ensure that I just get rid of this group of people so that way my mom can do what she needs to do. That would have made Bilhah basically is now a living widow in Jacob's household. But yes, thank you, Jordan. The same scenario with Absalom. And again, we see with a parent who wasn't taking care of business, but that kind of said something that you're going to come in and sort of prematurely take your inheritance and take a claim.
Yeah.
And so now we've seen the backstory for why the first 3 sons of Jacob are eliminated from birthrights or their inheritance. Who's next in line? We got Judah. Judah's next in line. I don't want to ruin it for you guys, but this is very good for Judah. So yeah, we see Jacob's sons in the next several group of verses, I think from about verse 23 to verse 29. This genealogy is sort of the bookend of the Jacob narratives. The whole family of Jacob is complete. Isaac's death is shared here. But it's not in chronological order based on what we see in the text. He doesn't die until Joseph is exiled, but the author is trying to wrap this sort of storyline up to move on. So that's really why you see this, and we see Esau is introduced here, which allows us to sort of wrap up Esau and his storyline. So Genesis 36, the last of the major genealogies in Genesis. I feel honored to be here for this one. This informs—
You're the expert.
Yeah, sure. This informs an ancient audience of some specific historical and political figures. They're going to be listening and going, oh, yep. It's just kind of putting things into place for them. We see a clear connection. I'm not going to read all the names. You guys do not want me to do this. But starting in Genesis 36, we see a clear connection that Esau is Edom. Israel has a long relationship with the Edomites. We see that in this, he takes his wives from the Canaanites. Inevitably, this is seen as derogatory. His marriages violated family values. There's this emphasis on the fact that there was a Canaanite absorption into this Edomite family. We also see a connection to Ishmael, which I think was interesting, also considered the non-elect among the patriarchs, but who still receives a blessing. And I think that is what we see here with Esau. He is still a son of Isaac, who also receives a patriarchal blessing. It's important to see that God is fulfilling his promises to even Esau.
Yeah, that's interesting. You said that. Do you think this is kind of mapping onto 34, where they wanted the chosen family to merge with the Canaanites, and they didn't? In 36, we see Esau's line did do that.
Yeah, and just like we see with Ishmael, God's going to take care of them. But interestingly, the Edomites aren't sort of, God doesn't say we need to destroy the Edomites, but we do see that about the Canaanites. So this is really a problem. What starts out being more of sort of a kinship relationship goes really south. So I don't want to give you the wrong impression when I say kinship, but let's keep going in the narrative. Just like we see Abraham and Lot sort of separating, you see that with Esau and Jacob. The people of God remained in the land while the rest moved eastward. But then they pack up and they move to Seir. Now, Moses talks about this specifically in Deuteronomy 2. After God's people have been traveling around Mount Seir for a time, he says this. He says, "Then the Lord said to me, you have been traveling around this mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command the people. You're about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the people of Esau who live in Seir. And they will be afraid of you, so be very careful. Do not contend with them, for I will not give you any of their land. No, not so much as for the sole of the foot to tread on, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession." So it's almost like just thinking about the beginning of this relationship. They move there for economic and social reasons, but who is it that's fulfilling this promise to Esau? I have given them, it's God. So it's not unlike the way Israel is given the land of Canaan. And if we dig around further, we're going to find there's some special provisions made for them in the assembly of Israel. Deuteronomy 23 says, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother." So while there's some positive notes here in the history, like we talked about this sort of kinship relationship, we find that Edom is condemned harshly on multiple occasions in their history with Israel. Think of the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all the biggies. You don't want them to prophesy something negative over you. You might say that they didn't treat Israel like a sibling. They were complicit in their destruction, the destruction of Judah at the time of the Babylonian conquest. They're a part of it. So I think you could, if you were to walk through the historical part of it, you would see the Edomites continually contending with the Israelites. That's kind of the way that I perceive it. We have a side note. If you look at verse 12, do you guys see that little in parentheses? We have this side note here about Timnah. It points out the heritage of Amalek. Now, if Amalek is subtracted from this, we would have 12 tribes, just like you do with Ishmael, just like you do with Israel. So why this little side note? Why is this sort of pulled aside? Timnah is a concubine. She's probably of lower status and was from among the peoples of that area. But this tells us that as the Edomites migrated to Seir, that they intermarried with some of the people around them, specifically the Horites in this particular instance. The Edomites dispossessed the land from them and destroyed them. That's listed in Deuteronomy. But the people that formed this clan would probably not be considered a part of that ancient kinship, if you'd say. So not only is it not a good relationship with the Edomites, but the Amalekites, oh man, that's an even worse story. So from Amalek, we have the Amalekites. You guys know that name, the who's who of bad guys in Israel's history. They're historically a major enemy to the Israelites from the beginning of their nationhood. And you can read about that in Exodus 17, how they attacked the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt. Israel was weak. Israel was defenseless. They were attacked unprovoked. And their tactics, their treatment of the Israelites was inhuman. They're known for treacherous, violent, barbaric aggression against Israel. So the Lord said that he would blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.
Wow.
That's not good. Deuteronomy 25, Moses reminds the people before they go in and enter to possess the land, don't forget to do this. God said he will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So throughout history, you'll see them repeatedly attack Israel. But then in 1 Samuel 15, God uses King Saul to destroy the people. I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but he's like, destroy them completely. King Saul doesn't, but there was a reason they were to destroy that people completely. Yeah, you guys familiar with the Amalekites? Now you know. It goes all the way back to the brother who went eastward. Now, we see chiefs come from Esau. We're wrapping this up. We see the sons of Seir, the Horite. We see kings who reigned in the land of Edom. And this is interesting. There's 8 kings identified who reigned in Edom before Israel gets its first king. King Saul. So this genealogy shows how Esau's line becomes a nation, right? Rebekah was told that in her womb were 2 nations, that the older would serve the younger. And so right now the Edomites are doing their thing, but in time we'll see how that's fulfilled, that they're going to be subject to the Israelites in time. But who is this God and why should we trust him? We've walked through 3 chapters together. We see the end of Jacob's narratives. I'm excited to get to the next section. Do you know who's going to be featured in the next section of narratives? Is it our guy? He gets a coat.
Cantor. Yeah.
Yeah. How is he going to do? I'm excited to see. I already know. But anyway, who is this God and why should we trust him? I think we've learned a lot about God's character. Is there anything that stuck out to you tonight that maybe you're like, I don't know that I considered that before, or it's really been just impressed upon me differently tonight? Anything that you would add to that?
I mean, I feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse every week by saying this, but the more I read through these texts and the more I get to hear awesome, fantastic teaching, the more I'm just reminded of God's faithfulness to his chosen family, and that the God of Genesis is the same as the God of 2021.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that gives me hope because it's not about the virtue and the goodness and this holy life of God's people.
Yeah.
All of this is God promising himself to us.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm excited for what's coming up next and the coming storyline. God is good.
Awesome.
So
you have crushed it. I am better off. I think we're all better off for this teaching today. So thanks, Angela.
Thank you.
Would you do us the honor of closing us out in prayer tonight?
Yeah, I will. Thank you guys for being here and for the feedback and everything. It's a lot of fun. Father God, thank you so much for revealing yourself to us. We know that as we humbly come to the word, that you're not a God who hides from us, but if we come to you in humility and ask and just seek answers, that you give it. You are the giver of wisdom. Lord, thank you for everyone who's listening to this message. And I just pray that you would plant these truths deep in our heart. The same goodness and faithfulness you showed back then, you are showing to your people today. We give you all the glory in Jesus' name. Amen.